to the war, it's time to take stock of what this has, what extent has it succeeded. I know military terms, it hasn't succeeded. So he hasn't won militarily, as in conquer the whole of Ukraine, despite specifically disowning that goal right at the beginning of the war. We now know that it is his goal, as the Kremlin has even said that they want to take more land. So this special military operation, he said it was about protecting people from genocide. Well, there was no genocide to begin with, because there was no details provided, no corroborative evidence. So it was a complete non-specificity of this allegation, which showed it to be such bunkum. Who was killed, where, when, how, by whom? How do you know? And how many that were killed? But anyway, in terms of denazifying the Ukraine, I mean, there are virtually no Nazis in Ukraine. Where you see that Putin's regime is definitely that way inclined, as in hyper-nationalist, militaristic, violently intolerant of the mildest dissent, with rigged elections, with a completely state-controlled media, with an extremely punitive approach to everything, and so on. Racist, violent, merciless, brutal, cult of the personality, trying to have someone as a present for life, and on and on. But none of which is true in Ukraine. And it is true that some of the Ukrainians say, well, those Ukrainians who fought alongside the Wehrmacht for Ukrainian independence, well, it was the right thing to do because we were in a desperate situation. We had to take help from anyone we could. I mean, nobody thinks that Hungarian independence is evil because they were happening on the German side, or Indian independence is evil because some Indian ultranationalists were on the German side, or whatever. Or Finnish independence is evil just because some of them were on the German side, and on and on and on. Um, Anyway, so as for demilitarizing Ukraine, well, that really has boomeranged because the Ukrainian army is bigger and better armed than ever. So, I mean, he couldn't have made it worse, really. And all these weapons that NATO and EU countries have furnished to the Ukrainians gratis since February 2022, well, if only Western countries had provided them prior to the invasion, perhaps the invasion would not have happened. So as for getting the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states, well, even now they still only control about 2/3 of the Donetsk People's Republic. The Russians, they control almost the whole of Luhansk. So put Donetsk and Luhansk together, that's the Donbass. They control over 2/3 of the Donbass, but they should control the whole of it. They controlled about 1/3 of it before this war began in earnest this February. They talked about getting all the way to Transnistria, claiming that the Russophone population there is oppressed, which is nonsense. They're not, and of course, Russia's been illegally occupying some of Moldova, that region called Transnistria, as in the eastern bank of the river Nistria, since 1991, when Russia started the civil war there. Anyway, so they want neutrality for Ukraine. Well, that couldn't be further from what's happened. Obviously, Ukraine is a candidate member of the European Union and is keener than ever to join NATO, though Ukraine is not actually joined NATO because that'd be the Third World War, because NATO countries would be obliged to defend Ukraine and there'd be a nuclear exchange, and even a small scale nuclear exchange would kill at least several million people. So, Nazis in Ukraine, come on. But I had a colleague, a British Polish chap actually, and he said the Azov battalion, well, they're like the Nazis of the Second World War. They raped women, and I mean that's probably true. The ones he's referring to, some of the Ukrainian ultranationalists, but all of them. I mean, how many? Obviously, rape is abominable, but I'm sorry to say that there are rapists in all armies. Not many. Most men are not like that at all. But you're going to find them in all nationalities and therefore in all armies. And most soldiers are completely innocent of this. Did they do it at an unusually high rate? I don't know. So, you could say that of any army. Wouldn't completely delegitimize the army. And they're not doing it now. I've not heard of a single allegation about that against the Azov battalion. This really is preposterous. The same could be said of the Red Army in 1945 in Germany. Some of them were Russian, some of them were Ukrainian, some of them were Kazakh, and so on. And obviously, most of them were innocent, but some of them did, which doesn't besmirch the honor of the whole of the Red Army. Anyway, as for these Russophone people who Putin is supposedly trying to be the savior of, well, in Mariupol, 89% Russian speaking, and he's wrecked the city. Scarcely a building is left standing. That's protecting them. How many hundreds of civilians did he kill in Mariupol to save them? I mean, if this is being saved, well, I'd rather not be, thank you. What saved them by killing them? Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city, very close to the Russian frontier. And he bombed it for a week. There have been missile strikes constantly. They've killed scores of civilians, and it's a 95% Russian speaking city. This is saving them. They were already in danger when Russia invaded Mykolaiv, but the majority of the population are native speakers of Russian. And again, this city has been wrecked. Many cluster bombs have been used, and so on. So dozens of civilians have been killed there as well. So they're only saved once they've been killed by Russia. I mean, wow, the stupidity of this is staggering. So it's obviously far more dangerous when Russia starts blowing up your building. Anyway, they've not succeeded in these goals. Now, NATO obviously had troops along the border with Russia, and in a year before the war, they had 4,650 NATO troops along the Russian frontier. They've now got 40,000, so almost 10 times higher. So it's massively backfired this, and Ukraine says NATO is going to build up its forces. NATO said it might even build up its forces along the Russian border to 300,000. If I were NATO, I'd be having war games in Finland along that border with Russia that Russia doesn't have to worry about right now, because Finland and Sweden have not been formally admitted to NATO because Turkey's saying, well, what about these Kurdish nationalists you host there? So even if Turkey doesn't have an alliance with them, all the other NATO countries could have an alliance, even not under the auspices of NATO. So NATO had a 1,207-kilometer border with Russia. Now, once Finland joins, that'll be 2,575 kilometers. So it's going to more than double. That was a border that Russia didn't have to worry about since 1945. And now they do have to worry about it and patrol it, which means more troops they can't send to Ukraine. So they're really running down the reserves, having to recall some of their peacekeepers from Nagorno-Karabakh to fight there. And these war games of Vostok 2022 in the Russian Far East, the Russians sent tens of thousands before. They've only got 15,000 going this year and very few vehicles or planes or anything. So how much has this cost? It's estimated to cost Russia at least $500 million per day. So it's about 80,000 casualties, NATO experts estimate. Now, in over 9 years in Afghanistan, the Soviets lost 15,000. That's what they admitted to. They would have been lying about that, as they lied about everything. But what was the real figure? Was it double that? Was it quintuple that? I don't know. And remember, the Soviets are not just the Russians. Only 50% of the Soviet population was Russian. So some of those Soviet soldiers killed fighting Afghanistan would have been Ukrainian or Georgian or Lithuanian and so on. Anyway, people say that the Russians lost a couple of thousand tanks, a couple of thousand armored personnel carriers. We don't know the actual number, but there are some open sources which can actually prove with photographic evidence how many it is. And it's over 1,000 of each. So they've used up almost their entire stock of high precision weapons and guided bombs. They've used dumb bombs. So they can't produce very many missiles because they don't have the microchips or semiconductors owing to sanctions. Their anti-ship missiles and Soviet Grads have got very short ranges, and they're being used and they're extremely inaccurate. So they just don't have enough hardware. They're having to just try and pilfer wherever they can by using trade ships from Syria, purchasing drones from Iran. That is a bit worrying because Iran produces a lot of them. They said that they're sort of quite rubbishy. They're cheap, but they do work somewhat. So you can buy lots of them. And North Korea's even suggested they sell artillery, because North Korea's got loads of artillery following Soviet doctrine. Their ideas of war starts with South Korea that just obliterates Seoul, which is quite close to the border. So the manpower situation is an ongoing headache for Russia. Their so-called voluntary mobilization. So they've sent over 30,000 soldiers to training camps, and they're going to be sent to the Ukraine. Some of them have as little as a week's training. These are people on a refresher course. They've done their 1 year military service. They're now in their 20s and 30s, and they're coming back. But they haven't been in the army for years, and technology's moved on. So to learn how to deal with the new hardware. So they're getting people out of prisons, including high security prisons, to volunteer to have your sentence remitted in return for going to fight. The illegal occupiers of South Ossetia, that's Georgian territory occupied by Russia. Some of them are being sent to the front. So according to even Russia's own finance ministry, there's a federal budget deficit of almost 900 billion rubles. The oil and gas revenues are down 23%, despite the high energy prices, because just less of it is being sold. A lot of countries won't buy it. And yes, you can sell more gas to China, but only have the pipeline capacity, which they know is going to take years to build. And when are they ever going to get these Western markets back? The UK, 10 years ago, 11% of the United Kingdom's energy was renewable. It's now 40%. At that rate, within 20 years, the UK won't use any oil, gas, or coal whatsoever. Now, the United Kingdom will probably never get 100% renewable. Maybe no country will, but they'll get very close. They'll be like 95% renewable, and they can easily do without Russian oil and gas in 20 years. So there were hundreds of billions of dollars that Russia's going to make over the next several years from selling energy to Western countries, and now they're not going to make that money. So there's going to be a loss of GDP of 8%. That's by the Russian finance ministry's own estimates. In reality, it'll be worse than that. So 2023, even Russia admits that their economy is going to shrink. They claim it will return to growth in 2024. I doubt it. I reckon they'll carry on contracting. So they can't conduct a lot of transactions. They're cut off from SWIFT. Even a Chinese bank was facilitating a workaround on this, has stopped doing it for fear of secondary sanctions. So their technology is already a generation behind the West, and it's going to retard even more. So the Russian military-industrial complex won't threaten the rest of the world except with its nukes, which is why they're so important. And Putin keeps reminding us that he could eliminate the entire human race. So yes, Putin wanted to occupy the whole of Ukraine. Anyway, so it was estimated by Western analysts that he would need at least 270,000 troops to do that. He went in with 200,000. They've now got considerably fewer, more like 170,000, which is why they're doing so poorly. And obviously, they only occupy about an additional 10% of Ukraine, more than they did in February 2022. So anyway, to occupy the entire country, they need something like 1 million troops, and their whole armed force is only about 1.1 million, and they've got many other frontiers to guard. So they just don't have the numbers. Which is not to say that things are easy for the Ukrainians. They're suffering serious losses, and Western will is flagging, not providing the weapons, not willing to pay the money, and suffering these eye-watering energy price increases. We've already seen Western unity fracturing. Some people are saying, shall we settle? Can we cut a deal? Can we twist Ukraine's arm into signing away their land just so we can turn on the oil and gas pipes again? Anyway, so Russia clearly did not achieve a blitzkrieg. So Putin, he had all sorts of advisors, but it seems he listened to those who were much more bellicose, who said, yeah, you can go ahead and win. So Yanukovych, who was Putin's puppet in Kiev, he ran away because of street protests in 2014. So Putin presumably calculated that Zelensky, this former comedian, would do likewise. But no, Zelensky rose to the occasion. All the world's a stage. He's an actor, and he was giving the performance of his lifetime. And what a bravura one it was, too. So then he's the toast of the free world. So Ukraine obviously is to be ripped to pieces by Russia. That was the idea. But that doesn't look likely. Now, it's rumored that Putin would actually be willing to settle for what he got now. If he can illegally occupy 20% of Ukraine, if Ukraine will agree to that de facto, or even better, de jure, then he might stop and consider that again, can try and sell that to the public as a victory. But about 17,000 Russians have been arrested on suspicion of anti-war protests. This is despite the Russian constitution specifically prohibiting censorship. Anyway, Article 20.2 of the Code of Administrative Offences has this crime: violation of the established order of organizing or holding meetings, rallies, demonstrations, marches, or pickets. Close quotation. Any of those things, that is a crime. So no to war t-shirt. Someone held up a sign and said 2 words, the Russian words for 2 words, and she was arrested for that. So, I mean, so you have no rights. Anyway, so Putin clearly is a war criminal and committing crimes against his own people, depriving them of their liberties. So discrediting the military is a crime, even if what you say is true about the military. Intentionally spreading false information, well, actually often it's information, it's not misinformation. You can only publish things about the war from official military sources, Russian military sources, as in, so then you have to be parroting it, so then every media outlet is saying exactly the same thing. Well, so there's no media individuality. So people who tell the plain truth about the bombing of Kharkiv, Odessa, and Mykolaiv, they've been flung in fetid dungeons. Anyway, so we know the war's going badly. Russia recently replaced the commander, the admiral commanding the Black Sea Fleet, and so forth, and quite a few of their generals have been bumped off by Ukrainian snipers. So these administrative cases, more like a civil case, but often if you're warned about that by the authorities and they won't arrest you about 3 weeks, got a chance to skip the country. But why is it not going better? So there are various people who've been prosecuted. Marina Osyannikova, she's the one who held up the anti-war sign courageously at a news broadcast, being prosecuted for that, you can get 7 years in prison for spreading misinformation about the military, which is actually usually true things you're saying. So they've criminalized telling the truth. So there aren't these large-scale anti-war demonstrations. It was a bit larger scale at the beginning of the war, and that's because of rule by fear. That's the way Putin does it. He's a thug. He's obviously a coward by himself and tries to intimidate people. He never goes near danger. He's never a soldier for a single day. Hey, neither was I. Um, but anyway, so people have often gone to nearby countries, to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the police are spying on people. The FSB are spying on people, and the FSB's role is the insecurity of Russians, keeping them unsafe, endangering them, keep making them fear their government. But some of the foremost liberal oppositionists are in jail. Most famously, Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, Vladimir Kara-Murza are in prison. Some of these people valiantly returned from abroad, knowing that they would be imprisoned in horrific circumstances. So some of them, if they've got Polish ancestry or Jewish ancestry, they leave and get citizenship elsewhere. So the general prosecutor's website office says it's blocked over 7,000 websites to keep people in ignorance because they mustn't know the truth. This is a government that's afraid of the truth. So anyway, things which are mass media outlets, various agencies, various foundations, they've been blocked. Editorial boards have often left the country because they can't actually report news. The journalism has been effectively criminalized in Russia. You can only be a mouthpiece for the Kremlin. So lots of politicians, journalists, other public figures and intellectuals, they've been labeled foreign agent. They have to say they're a foreign agent. Everything they publish, they have to go through this very rigorous audit all the time. So a lot of people are downloading VPNs. It's increased 25-fold, 25 million. So Russians are using VPNs, these virtual private networks which allow them to circumvent state censorship because they want to find out what's actually going on. Anyway, but if you turn on the VPN, you can't use state services. You can't use this Yandex thing, which is a ride-hailing app, or Kommersant, a major newspaper, RBC, which is a major newspaper as well. So even that's going to make your phone heat up. It's going to make your battery run down very quickly. So the ruling elite doesn't really support this. They have to pretend to support it. They've lost a lot of money. They've lost their cryptocurrencies. They're losing their properties abroad. Assets could be frozen. They recognize it's disastrous. The minor airlines are going bust. The costs of going on holiday abroad has increased something like 70%. Aeroflot is not going to have an airworthy fleet in a few years' time. Their software can't be updated. The software that you get, which is sort of counterfeited, that can suddenly stop working when you're in the air, and you could crash to Earth. So anyway, as the highest estimate of the Russian elite that support the war is something like 30%. Not all the others are against. Some would be neutral. So going to Western countries is no longer so easy. They can't get European Union tourist visas anymore, or they've had to withdraw their children from abroad. And remember, the Russian upper class, they have their children educated in the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Germany, the United States, Republic of Ireland, not in Russia. Anyway, there are those who try to curry favor with Putin by calling for nuking Russia, but it's really not looking good for him now. But I think, Putin might like to step down, but only if he feels he can do so securely, hand over to someone who continue his legacy. But he saw what happened when Nazarbayev tried to do that in Kazakhstan. So, I think the regime will be able to keep going for a decade or something. I don't think there's going to be immediate change very soon. People say that Putin's ill. Clearly he is ill. Doesn't mean he's necessarily dying. Dying can be a very slow process, can take 10 years, giving the best medical care that money can buy. So, I think this war's going to go on for at least another 18 months, but could be several years. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.